Oh, hello, everybody, and welcome to Textile Medley. My name is Danalia, and I am a white woman with short brown hair and blue glasses, sitting in a bedroom with some art around me. I have gray pom-pom earrings and a lovely knitted top, which you will see later in one of the presentations. I am also the program manager for Intertwine Arts, the organization that is hosting this talk today, which is a nonprofit whose mission is to inspire creativity, joy, and self-confidence through free-form weaving for people of all ages with disabilities or chronic illness. Today, we are here for Textile Medley, which is a lunchtime artist talk series that Intertwine Arts is hosting over the summer, where we highlight amazing artists with textile practices and influences alongside the amazing textile artists that we Intertwine Arts have on staff. Some people may or may not know that we recently went through a renaming from Sayori Arts NYC to Intertwine Arts, and this series is sort of part of that change. While we remain weaving focused, we love to encourage and dip our toes into a range of fiber mediums, techniques, and tools that allow everyone to express their tactile creativity in ways that are accessible for disabled and chronically ill artists. Today, for the second in our series, we are interweaving the arts practices of Nicole Yi Messier and Jill Gutman Schoenfuss. We are going to start off with Nicole sharing her work for 15 to 20 minutes. Then we will share Jill's work for 15 to 20 minutes. And then after that, Jill and Nicole will discuss many of the commonalities and divergences in their work and experiences. And finally, this will be followed up by a short Q&A if we find the time. So without further ado, I am going to let Nicole take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks to the Intertwine Arts team for having me here. I'm just, before I get started, going to explain how I'm going to walk through the slides. As I switch between slides, I'll give a verbal cue, and then I'll start by describing what's on the slide from a visual perspective, and then talk about it. So hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Yi Messier. I am a mixed race woman with dark brown hair that's tied back in a half ponytail about shoulder length. I'm wearing glasses, and behind me you will see a pegboard with some of my tools in my home studio. I use the pronouns she, her. The first slide has my logo, which is my initials, Nicole Yi Messier, in white, overlaid on a background that I made using a code-based creative coding platform called Open Frameworks. And so my name is Nicole Yi Messier. I'm a artist, creative technologist, and educator with a focus on storytelling, craft, and community. My work and my practice mixes both physical and digital technologies into interactive installations, soft interfaces, and various forms that often unleash exploratory forms of interaction. I'm really interested in ways that we can make more expressive and diverse forms of electronics, machines, using craft-based mediums. I moved to the next slide, and the background is an orange and pink slide and has the title Craftwork Collective. And there's a visual node-based system that showcases different topics that range from textiles to stories to interactive to craft. I'm part of a studio and collective called Craftwork, and we're a material-focused craft design and art studio and collective exploring the nature of craft through innovation, storytelling, and future building. We're really interested in working with emerging technologies mixed with traditional base craft mediums. And a lot of the projects that I'll walk through today are both a mix of personal projects as well as projects I've done with Craftwork. I've moved to the next slide, which is a title slide that says Ancient Futures in white text and credits myself, Nicole Yi Messier, my collaborator, Victoria Magnello, and our collective Craftwork. I've moved to the next slide, which shows a picture of a project I'm going to talk about called Ancient Futures. This is an interactive installation, and in the image, you'll see a woven textile hanging from two half circular rods, and woven into the textile are fiber optics, LEDs, and those are connected to wires that is connected to a microcontroller that is connected to a computer that's connected to a microphone and a touchscreen. So this project is a triple woven interactive installation that is made with soft electronics to collect, store, and cumulatively visualize solicited secrets and stories from viewers using sentiment analysis and long-term data storage. And this is a node to how textiles have held secrets and stories across time and space. So someone can walk up to the interactive installation and speak into the microphone and share a story or a message, and the software will take that message and do a speech to text analysis and then do a sentiment analysis, seeing kind of the overall mood of that message and then reflect that back in light. So if the message were to, for example, lean more negative, the light would be a brighter red. If it were a happier tone, it would be a brighter blue. I've moved to the next slide, which shows an image from an open studio day that I did as part of my artist residency at Culture Hub, New York City. In the background, you'll see the same interactive installation, and in the center, there's a woman who's looking at a number of swatches. So as part of my practice and my practice with my collaborators at Craftwork, we're often working with materials that aren't found in the same space. So traditional textile materials mixed with electronics and fiber optics. So there's really no rubric for how we're supposed to make things. So we often make small scale swatches and prototypes before we make our larger pieces. And so we've decided to show our work in progress pieces alongside the larger ones to showcase an insight into our making process. And moving to the next slide, which is also a picture of the same installation, but in a new location. You'll see my collaborator in the image, Victoria Manganello, using the software and the touchscreen and storing her own secret within the textile. And this is a picture from the Material Technology exhibition at the Australian Tapestry Workshop in Melbourne, Australia. Moving to the next slide, this image is a close-up image of one of our swatches. This uses a raspberry red and gold yarn, and then in it are woven fiber optics that are about a third of them are woven in, and then we're using gravity. So one end has this kind of dangling feeling and the other end are connected to the electronics. And so by generating these smaller scale work in progress pieces, we've been exploring ways and avenues for our materials to contribute and guide to both our conversation of concept and storytelling, while being able to have a practice that is material driven. Moving to the next slide showcases 3 more prototypes in work in progress swatches that we made. On the left, you'll see a square swatch that has 4 fiber optics woven into it. And here we're exploring with different materials that we can use. So instead of using hard wire along the edges of this piece are conductive threads that we're using. And we have sewn in LEDs that are connected through these threads, lighting up the piece. And then on the right side, you'll see 2 different swatches where we're playing with different architectural feels of the textile and trying different weaving techniques. Moving to the next slide is a picture of a number of handheld looms with work in progress swatches on them. As part of our practice, we facilitate workshops as an opportunity for us to bring the community into our work. So this picture is from a workshop that we gave at Culture Hub in New York City, where participants learned how to create basic weavings and then brought their weavings to life by introducing light and fiber optics into them. And the idea is we held 2 workshops. The set of participants in the first workshop started them, and then the set of participants in the second workshop picked up where everyone else left off. And the idea is eventually these pieces will be complete and can be connected to the overall ancient futures system. Moving to the next slide is a title slide with a black background and white text that says algorithmic textures and my name. So instead of using a pen or pencil to draw, or maybe a paintbrush to paint, I use code as my drawing tool to make visual expressions as well as interactive installations. And this showcases another part of my practice where I'm working on creating various visual images using code and translating them into print, textiles, and paper cultures. The series is called Algorithmic Textures, and it's an ongoing study and practice of creating these digital images. On the screen, you'll see a black visual on a white background, and it's 2 parabolas that are upside down and creating an oval shaped diamond, and the visual language of it are small black dots. So for this series, I'm exploring patterns with a focus on optical illusions, repetition, and perception through mathematical formulas and logic to entice a sense of algorithmic rhythms. And by reframing these digital algorithms that are so often only found in code or on screen into physical form, I'm hoping to inject a sense of wonder through tangibility into otherwise formulaic and digital environments. This shows a picture of a risograph print I made using the same visual. The picture is of a collaborator holding the image in front of a risograph printer, and the visual this time is blue. I'm going to skip over a few slides. The next slide is a title slide called Swatchbook as Prototyping Archive, and it credits myself, Victoria Manganello, and Craftwork. A lot of times we're working with materials that aren't found within the same space, such as conductive threads, conductive yarns, and conductive fabrics to make circuitry or interactive soft interfaces. So as part of our practice, we make a lot of swatches. And so we've started to showcase these swatches as an opportunity to showcase the process. And so on screen, you'll see images of a number of swatches that were made using machine knitting. And the techniques vary from using conductive yarns to create stretch sensors, to conductive threads to make circuit paths, to traditional machine knitting stitches, such as a honeycomb slit stitch. Another project that I've worked on is called Rebel Off the Grid. And I made the following piece at Electronic Textile Camp. I've moved to the next slide, which is an image of me wearing these wearable pieces, and I'm attached to them, and then I'm attached to another person in the space who also has wearable pieces. So Rebel Off the Grid is a performative exploration of turning bodies into systems by hacking radio signals as a form of communication in musical instruments. And so the final e-textile pieces that were created are a series of wearable AM, FM radios and antennas broadcasting over available stations performed in a small space in a paper mill to replicate living off the grid. Moving to the next slide shows a picture of the cuff that I'm wearing in the previous image. And that cuff is made with copper conductive fabric, muslin, and traditional sewing snaps. And this was the antenna, and this piece is actually will be on view at the Pacific Northwest Quilt and Fiber Arts Museum as part of the Small Expressions 2023 traveling exhibition. I'm also a community organizer, and I help run an artist residency called Electronic Textile Camp. I've moved to a slide that showcases the Electronic Textile Camp logo and has a background gradient that moves from pink to green. And so community organization is a large part of my practice. It's a way to share this niche world of e-textiles. And so Electronic Textile Camp's an annual week-long residency where e-textile and electronic craft practitioners come together to work and share their work through workshop facilitation, project making over a week. We've held this twice in upstate New York at Wasate Project. Last fall was at Prairie Run Artist Residency in Michigan, and we'll be running it again in Michigan this year. The last slide I will talk about, or the last project I will talk about, is called the Domestic Machine. This is another craftwork project that is between myself and Victoria Manganello. And we're also working with a film collective called Indigo Collective. So the Domestic Machine is a documentary film taking a glimpse into the world of open source education and online craft communities, and specifically the machine knitting community. And we are looking specifically at 6 people who use machine knitting, and 3 of those women are baby boomer women who have uploaded videos to YouTube, and we're juxtaposing them against 3 millennial and Gen Zer subjects who use machine knitting in their various practices. Some of them are community organizers, some of them are fashion designers, and some are educators. And we're telling this story about how these women who've uploaded these videos have kind of archived this niche craft of machine knitting, and how the younger generation has learned through them, and how through the internet we're all connected, even if we don't quite understand the impacts that we're having on each other. We're actually gearing up for our first travel shoot this weekend, and we'll be going to Providence, Rhode Island to film our first subject, and her name is Lindsay Deegan. She has a fashion brand called Deegan, but she also has an online knitting social platform called the Knit Club. And this was born from a group of knitters who didn't feel like they belonged in the fashion industry and didn't have an online platform to come together and share. So she created that, and anyone can join for free. And there's also tiered membership if you'd like to have workshops and access to educational materials. But as part of our first shoot, we will be filming an in real life knit club. So if you're in the Providence or Massachusetts area and would like to know more, you can join Knit Club through this link, and there's details over there on how to participate. And I've moved to the last slide, which just says thank you, and has various Instagram handles for myself, Craftwork Collective, and the documentary, The Domestic Machine. And I'll pass it back off, or I'll pass it over to Jill, actually.
Thank you so much for sharing. That was amazing. There's some great community work and innovative work. That's great to see. So we are going to move along to Jill, who is going to share her screen.
Hi, everyone. You can see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay. So my name is Jill Gutman Schoenfuss. I am a white woman with curly blonde hair, and I am wearing a knit cowl that's multicolor, and the background is mostly white, and you can see a little bit of a print in the corner. This first slide has a pink and purple background, It has my logo for my company, which is Jagant Designs, and my name. Just for brevity's sake, all of my slides have, going forward, have a pink and white abstract background, so I won't describe that for every slide. And my pronouns are she, her. I don't think I mentioned that. So I'm gonna pause here just for a minute to talk a little bit about my background. First of all, full disclosure, you might notice a similarity in last names. So Danalia is my daughter, and I also do some grant writing for Intertwine Arts. I learned to knit when I was 5 years old. My grandmother taught me. And while I was growing up, I did a lot of different crafts. When I got into high school, the craft room and the craft classes that I took were sort of my home away from home, my safe place. I did a lot of different things, but one thing that really appealed to me was weaving. So I did do a lot of weaving in high school, and I also took weaving classes in college. After college, at my first job, there was a woman who was a very avid and talented knitter and got me back into knitting. I had moved from Massachusetts, where I grew up, to Connecticut for this first job, and it was a little bit lonely at first. And so knitting was kind of my refuge, and I decided that I was going to learn how to knit well enough to be able to design my own patterns. So I did that, and some fellow knitters said to me, you know, that they thought that my designs were good enough to be published, but I didn't really at first know how to go about doing that. But I was signed up for a knitting conference, and at that conference, a wonderful designer, Melissa Leitman, was offering a class on how to get into the knitwear design business. So I took the class, and it seemed, you know, other than having some talent, that the barriers to entry were not that great. And so I submitted 2 designs to my favorite knitting magazine, which is Vogue Knitting. And both of these designs were accepted for publication. So these were the first published designs that I had. This picture, this slide has 2 photos of the same woman. I'm going to focus more on the knitted items as opposed to the people when I'm doing my descriptions. But on the left, there is a woman wearing a multicolored scarf. It's mostly pink, orange, and purple. And on the right is a woman wearing also a scarf that is mostly blue in color and has tassels on the ends. So not only were both of my designs accepted for publication the very first time I applied, but I had incredible beginner's luck. And actually, one of them ended up on the cover of the magazine. So on this slide, it's the same picture of the woman with the mostly pink scarf, but this is the cover, which says Vogue Knitting and has a few other captions on it. So this was in 2003 that these designs were first published. So it's been 20 years since that time. And I have had a full-time career, not in the arts, but in the nonprofit sector. And so my designing has been on a very part-time basis, but over those 20 years, I have had a few dozen designs that have been published in different magazines, books for pattern and yarn companies. So in putting this slideshow together, one thing that had never occurred to me before is how much weaving has really influenced a lot of the ways that I design my knitting. And I have kind of organized the slides having to do with what the inspiration thread has been for me. So, so this slide has 4 different photographs on it. There's a woman wearing a poncho that is mostly teal blue and then has a multicolored design. There's a woman wearing a capelet that is multicolored. There is a woman wearing a scarf, which is multicolored with squares. And then there's a woman with a shawl that has a black background and multicolored squares. So the technique, I would have to say my most favorite technique is called intarsia. And intarsia is quite like certain kinds of tapestry weaving. So what you might consider sort of regular knitting that's one color or stripes, you carry the same color of yarn all the way across the different rows that you're knitting. In intarsia, you only carry the yarn partway, and there's at least 2 usually different colors. As you can see in these works, I have many colors that I carry across. And tapestry weaving was one of my favorite techniques to use when I was weaving. And it was only through putting this together that I kind of put those 2 things together, that that may be part of the reason why I gravitated toward intarsia. The other thing I want to mention as an inspiration is quite often the yarn that I'm using provides the inspiration. And all 4 of these use at least somewhat the same yarn, which is called Noro, is the name of the company, Crayon. And this yarn has it's multicolored, but it has very long color runs. And I thought it was interesting to make garments that use those color runs in different ways. And so that is kind of the idea behind all of these intarsia pieces. These are 2 more intarsia pieces that don't exactly follow along with the ones on the prior slide. On the left, there is someone you might recognize wearing I'm not exactly sure what to call this, because on the left side, it's like a poncho, and on the right side, it's like a sweater because it has a sleeve. And it is black, different colors of gray and pink, with a square motif toward the bottom on one side. And then on the right is a woman wearing a sweater that is blue, like a dark blue on the bottom and kind of a rusty red on the top. And it also has a motif of squares. And I think part of the reason why I have a lot of squares in my work is because geometric shapes are easier to do in intarsia than if you're doing something with a curve or something kind of abstract. So I just think that it makes the pattern easier for people to follow. so the next slide is also in Tarja, but it is different than the previous slides. So I'll just start out with a description going across from the left. There's a woman wearing a halter top that is orange. Then there's the same woman from the beginning. This is the woman wearing the blue scarf with the tassels. There's a woman wearing a capelet that is blues and greens. And then there is a woman wearing a shawl that is two different kinds of yarn. It makes squares and it's blues with tassels on the ends. So this is a technique that it's in Tarja, but I use two different yarns that have different textures for most of these pieces. The one that was originally in Vogue Knitting is only one yarn. And this kind of mimics a knitting technique called entrelac, where the squares kind of make almost like a ribbony woven sort of look to them. At least that's how it looks to me. And with one type of yarn, the squares are all what's called garter stitch, which means all the rows are knit stitches. And then the other yarn that I use is stockinette stitch, which is the right side is knitted and the wrong side is purled. So it has two different textures to it as well. All of the except for the one that was in Vogue Knitting that I showed before, all of these use, one is a ribbony yarn, so it's like a flat yarn, and then the other one is a more traditional yarn. So another thing that inspires me is different knit stitches. And so one of my most favorite knit stitches is called half linen stitch. And what I like about this stitch is it's flatter than normal knitting, and it also has a woven look to it. It's comprised of knits and purls, but some of the stitches are also slipped without knitting them. And then you bring the yarn across the front and you get these what are called floats across the front. And to me, that's what makes it have a woven look to it. So on the left is an example of half linen stitch that is one color, and then on the right, it's with two different colors, white and blue. And so you can, one thing that makes this sort of an easy way to get a colorful knit piece is you only carry one yarn across at a time. So for this multicolored swatch, though, you do you do 2 rows of each color, but you get this very variegated look to the knitting because some of the stitches are being slipped. So this next slide is a bunch of designs that I've done that are in half linen stitch with other stitches thrown in to make them a little more interesting. But on the left is a woman wearing a mauve sweater that has ruffles. Then there are 3 scarves. These were part of a series in a book. So where you used a technique to make 3 different types of scarves. So there's a woman with a blue a variegated blue scarf. There's a woman with a solid blue scarf, and then there's a scarf that is black, gray, and white. And then there's a woman wearing an orange sweater with a tie in the front. So here are some more half linen stitch items. This gentleman here on the left is wearing it's kind of a beige brown vest, and it's all half linen stitch, but here I used other colors and it gives it almost a Fair Isle look. Then there's a woman wearing a multicolored capelet. A nice thing about half linen stitch is when you use a multicolored yarn or you make stripes, it kind of blends the stripes so you don't have such a sharp demarcation between the stripes. Then there's a purse that is brown, and that was knit with a ribbon yarn and then kind of a traditional yarn that was sparkly. And then there's a woman with a pink poncho that is made all with ribbon yarn, and it has fur on one edge that's kind of a multi-gray color. Not doing great for time here. So the next stitch that I'm going to talk about is feather and fan stitch, and I'll go through these next slides rather quickly, maybe without too much description. But this is a stitch pattern that you make by doing decreases and yarn over increases, and it gives you this wavy sort of look to the items. And so there's a shawl with that wavy look, and then I have two afghans. One is oranges and one is purples and greens. And then here are a couple more shawls with that same technique. You can see Dana again. Oh, Dana also put, so one of those afghans I made for Dana, so she's holding it up there. And this is a shawl that is in different colors of blue and then white. And at the bottom is a multicolored blue shawl. This shawl at the bottom was also part of a challenge to make something that was only 25% typical yarn. So this is also made with fabric strips and blue plastic bags that were cut into strips. So on this next slide, there are a couple more. These are one-offs that I was inspired by the stitches. So Dana's actually wearing this vest right now. And I was inspired by this stitch that runs up the sides of the V-neck. This is it's a beige vest. Then there's a woman wearing a pink capelet, and I was inspired by this stitch pattern at the bottom that's kind of picoted, and it has bobbles along the bottom. Then there's a young woman who happens to be my other daughter, who is modeling a halter top, and it was this stitch pattern here that inspired me to come up with this design. And then on the bottom right, there's a woman. She's wearing the same cowl that I'm wearing, and this cowl alternated through 5 different stitches. But what I thought was unique about this pattern, and I really haven't ever seen a pattern written like this before, although there may be one that exists, but it doesn't give you a prescribed number of rows for the different stitches. You change the stitch when the color of the yarn changes. So you do it however many rows it is, and then when you hit the next color in the ball of yarn, you change to the next stitch. So that is the end of my talk. This last slide has my logo again and some contact information. I've also included my Pinterest link because one of the things that I find fascinating about knitting is where do people's ideas come from? Where does their inspiration come from? And so I have a lot of knitting inspiration boards on my Pinterest account that might be of interest to people. And then on the right side of the slide is just a little swatch of a project I'm currently working on, which is a technique called mitered squares, and it's a multi-blue piece.
All right, thank you so much for sharing, Jill. I am biased because, as has been shared, I am your daughter and I am wearing a piece and have one of the blankets here, but it's really nice to hear you lay it all out in a way that I've never really heard. I am going to spotlight myself as well as Nicole as we move into the discussion part of this talk. So it's really great seeing all of your work. I see like it's very different, but both of your work, but at the same time, I see commonalities of geometry, of influences from textile communities. I mean, you started off, Jill, by being like engaging with the community to become a knitwear designer, and you do a lot of community work, Nicole. So I guess something to talk about is, so what have you sort of learned or gained from the textile communities that you engage with?
I can kick it off. I think a lot of times in community, working alongside people, you can learn faster. And so, for example, those machine knit swatches that I showcased, I made those with my collaborator, Victoria. And so oftentimes working together, we can like debug and figure out what's going wrong with the machine, or what, how to fix a certain like drop stitch, as opposed to working alone.
Well, have you engaged in that way or gained, Jill?
So I the internet was not so much of a thing when I first got into knitting. And so I would say my first knitting community was a group of women that I was actually introduced to them by my sister. I have 3 sisters and we all knit. And someone came up with the name Yarn Sluts. So we were the Yarn Sluts. And it was women, we were all different ages, but just very avid knitters. And they were actually the ones who encouraged me to figure out how to get my work published. But I've also been on some online communities like Ravelry, and which I know sometimes is controversial, but I have had some good experiences with Ravelry. Also, I've gone to a lot of in-person conferences, and also with the advent of COVID, a lot of conferences went virtual for a while, and so I took some classes online in the past few years, and that has it's been both a way to learn techniques, but also to commune with other people who are knitters.
Well, and I think that's something to really hit on, is COVID did sort of change the way, like have a big effect on the craft community in general. And I know, Nicole, I mean, you're documenting a lot of experiences that way. Do you have anything to share about sort of that change in the communities during that time?
During that, yeah, I would say, you know, Jill mentioned the in-person knitting circles, and kind of the move to online, I see just as an expansion of that. Instead of being bound by the geography or the vicinity that we're in, we can now connect with a whole range of different knitting communities across geographic boundaries. So I see it based in that tradition of in real life knit circles, just being able to expand online and finding kind of your community and your crew regardless of where you are.
Something that we had been talking about too is how different generations kind of interact with knitting, crafting, making. I know that like I see things online that will to do, or I've gone to queer craft club in my area as because I think some people do crave the in-person. But there's a lot of like sharing over Instagram and all of that. And so like, how do you think there may be generational differences between how people interact with craft?
Well,
Yeah.
you know, being someone who has knitted through different ages of my life, like I said, you know, originally there really wasn't any sort of online presence. Although, I mean, there was email, and the women that I was friends with were from all over the country, so we would only see each other for the most part at conferences. But then we had like a round robin email that was ongoing for many years. You know, I think sometimes it depends on how tech savvy people are. And I would say people, you know, in my generation, it really varies greatly. I would say I'm a little more tech savvy than some people, and my age, and maybe not as much as some, but you know, more than most. I would say my husband was in the IT industry, so I picked up a lot of stuff from him. But you know, I would say now I do a lot more online than I do in person.
Yeah, I think craft-based mediums are something that have traditionally been passed down from generation to generation through in-person teaching. So having online communities or online documentation and tutorials really provides a way for anyone to learn it, and for these craft-based mediums not to be kind of lost with time.
I see this narrative a lot of like, and I mean, I experienced it in that, like, I know Jill tried to teach me how to knit when I was young, and I didn't have the patience for it. I think I now do, now that I do weaving and now I'm super engaged in craft in general. And I feel that happens a lot with people where they also re-engage with it later in life, or they remember their families did it. Um, so I definitely see that recurring. And also in our workshops, like we have people who say like, oh, I made art when I was little, but I was discouraged from it, or I forgot about it. And so thank you, like we're rediscovering it now. So there's definitely like a theme of that.
One thing that I think is interesting along those lines is one thing that I did do in my nonprofit career was I started a program called Stitch Together, which was it was a business that was run by teenagers that were part of the foster care system in Connecticut. And it was a program that ran for about 10 years. I was involved with it off and on, but I was the one who started it. And one thing that was interesting was when I was teaching, it was primarily young women, to knit, you could tell when someone had learned to knit previously. They had that motor memory, and they would pick it up much more easily than someone who had never done it before.
Mhm.
But it also had a lot of, it was surprising how meaningful it was to, teenagers who, you'd probably think were, more engaged or more interested in other things. But some of them have actually found me on Facebook and friended me, and are still knitting to this day, because of their involvement in that program. And they're, mostly, I would say, in their mid to late 30s now.
Yeah, and you both have teaching practices as well. That's something you have in common.
Mhm.
Uh, if you guys don't mind, there are some questions in the comments. Would you like me to pull from those?
Sure.
Sure.
So one question I have is, how do you save/protect your work?
For me, I do a lot of documentation as a way of saving it. And then as mentioned and like shown in our work, I do a lot of swatch making, and we document them a lot of times by placing them on cards and documenting what we did, or in binders, and then having basically swatch books or swatch boxes to save them. And then for the larger pieces, it's really they're in boxes, and just being careful with them.
I'm wondering if they mean protect, like as in, from a copyright perspective.
Oh,
I'm not
No,
really sure.
just in general, in terms of how do you protect your work once it's completed. I know that for a lot of artists, it's sometimes it's an afterthought, depending on the medium that you use to protect your work, in terms of if it's textiles, like how do you maintain it from deteriorating. For digital stuff, I imagine that there's always different versions and iterations that happened, and also they're saved in multiple drives. I currently work at a museum, and I also was interning at an archive, and that was one of the things that we kept coming across, is that we see a lot of artists creating wonderful, beautiful things, but in terms of how do we protect our work is almost always an afterthought. So I was wondering if that's a consideration that you have, or are you like, okay, this work, I know that this work is going to be ephemeral. It has a time limit, or it's not something that you're thinking is going to make it for many, many, many years.
mm,
So some of my pieces I don't have. Most things that are published in books and magazines, the samples are retained by the publisher. Some things I've reknitted, like the vest that Dana has on, I don't actually have the original. This is something that I've reknit. I would say, I give some attention to preserving things, but probably not as much as I should. But usually I keep things in some kind of a plastic container, either with a zipper or actual Ziploc, extra large Ziploc bags. And some things I kind of keep out just for inspiration around my studio.
I will say that we have some people with obligations to get to after this, so we're going to have to keep it short. But if you have anything to contribute, Nicole, please share.
I think to add, the way I preserve the best is documentation, so through imagery, and then working with electronics and textiles and conductive fabrics. The conductive fabrics, they just do break down over time, so it's a part of the process that I've just accepted, that they will decay, and being okay with it and making sure to document it through images, and that's the way I'm preserving it.
Yeah, I think process-based in general is where a lot of the art world is going. And that's
Mhm.
not to say everybody's doing that, but it's definitely something that I see, especially in like within textile artists, is that things are ephemeral and it's okay if they're not here forever.
Mhm.
And I think that's something that a lot of people explore and is an important thing to explore too as a culture as well.
Mhm.
But we unfortunately do have to end. But I want to thank everybody for joining us for Textile Medley. I am going to share my screen to share some of the contact information. So you can reach out to Nicole and Jill and also check out some of those amazing projects, the Domestic Machine and Craftwork Collective. And of course, check out Intertwine Arts as well. We will have our next and last in the series of Textile Medley on August 30th with Alex Goldberg and Brandy Godsill. They are both amazing artists. They have garment making experience. They go on a bunch of residencies and will be sharing a lot of those experiences with us. And of course, shameless plug, if you have the ability, please donate to Intertwine Arts. It helps us continue to do these webinars as well as supports our arts programming for people with disabilities and chronic illness. So once again, thank you everybody for joining us for Textile Medley, and I hope to see you all in the future. Happy weaving.